There is a strange kind of fear that can arrive after 40. You look around at the life you spent years building, and instead of feeling proud or settled, you quietly wonder, how did I get here? Maybe nothing has completely fallen apart. You still pay the bills. You answer messages. You show up when people need you. From the outside, your life may even look stable. But somewhere along the way, the version of you who knew what they wanted seems to have disappeared. And now the hardest question is no longer, what should I do next? It is, who am I supposed to become now? Feeling lost in midlife does not always mean your life has gone wrong. Sometimes it means the life that once fit you no longer does. The priorities that guided you at 30 may not guide you at 45. Relationships change. Careers lose their meaning. Children grow up. Parents age. Bodies change. Certain dreams become less important, while other desires you ignored for years become impossible to dismiss. And when several of those changes happen close together, it can feel less like a transition and more like losing your internal map. If conversations like this help you feel a little less alone, subscribe to A Friend to Heal With. This is a space for people navigating the emotional changes adulthood rarely prepares us for. And tell us in the comments what city, state, or country you are watching from. Sometimes simply seeing where everyone is listening from reminds us that people everywhere are quietly rebuilding parts of their lives. Because reinventing yourself after 40 does not begin by creating an impressive new life. It begins by understanding why the old one suddenly feels unfamiliar. Imagine a man named Daniel. He is 46. He has worked for the same company for almost 17 years. He has a decent salary, a respectable position, and a calendar filled with responsibilities. One Tuesday morning, he is sitting in his car outside the office. The engine is off. People are walking past him carrying coffee, checking their phones, beginning another ordinary workday. Daniel knows he needs to go inside, but he just sits there. Not because something terrible happened that morning. Nothing happened. And somehow, that is exactly what bothers him. He suddenly realizes that he can imagine tomorrow, next month, and even next year with uncomfortable accuracy. The same commute, the same meetings, the same polite conversations, the same Sunday night heaviness. And a thought enters his mind that he immediately tries to dismiss. Is this really what the rest of my life is going to feel like? Many adults experience some version of that moment. It may happen after a divorce, after children become independent, after losing a parent, after reaching a career goal that was supposed to feel more satisfying, after moving somewhere new, or sometimes after nothing dramatic at all. You simply notice that you have become very good at maintaining a life you are no longer sure you want. That realization can bring guilt. You may think, other people would be grateful for what I have, and perhaps they would. But gratitude and dissatisfaction can exist at the same time. You can appreciate what your life has given you while also recognizing that something inside you has changed. One reason this feels so unsettling is that identity is often built around roles. For years, you may have known yourself as the provider, the parent, the spouse, the dependable employee, the responsible daughter, the person everyone calls when something goes wrong. Those roles are real, but they are not the whole of you. And when a role changes or loses its meaning, you can suddenly feel as though part of your identity disappeared with it. So consider something carefully. If you removed your job title, your relationship status, your responsibilities, and the roles other people depend on you to perform, what would remain? You may not have an easy answer. That does not mean there is nothing there. It may simply mean you have spent so long responding to life that you have had very little space to hear yourself. And that creates an important question. Because before you can reinvent yourself, you have to understand why the person you have already become can sometimes be so difficult to leave behind. When you are 22, changing direction can feel like exploration. At 42, the same change can feel like evidence that you made a mistake. That difference matters. By midlife, most people have accumulated something younger versions of themselves did not have: history, years of choices, responsibilities, relationships, financial commitments, expectations, a reputation. People who have become accustomed to a certain version of you. So when you imagine changing, you are rarely changing one thing. You may feel as though you are challenging the entire story of your adult life. Suppose a woman has spent 20 years believing she should be practical. She chooses stable work, becomes the person her family can rely on, postpones creative interests, and rarely asks herself what she wants because there is always something more urgent to handle. At 49, she starts thinking about doing something different. Immediately, another voice appears. You are too old to start. You should have figured this out years ago. What if you waste everything you built? What will people think? These thoughts can feel like objective truth. Often, they are attempts to protect us from uncertainty. The mind tends to prefer what is familiar because familiar things are easier to predict. Even an unsatisfying situation can feel psychologically safer than a future we cannot control. That is why people sometimes remain in jobs they deeply dislike, relationships that no longer reflect who they are, routines that make them feel numb, or identities they quietly outgrew. The old life may be uncomfortable, but at least you understand its rules. A new life asks something much more frightening. It asks you to become a beginner again. And adulthood does not always make room for beginners. We expect someone in their 40s or 50s to know what they are doing, to be established, to be confident, to have answers. So, admitting, "I don't know what comes next," can feel embarrassing. But uncertainty is not always evidence that you are failing. Sometimes uncertainty appears because the answers that guided you before are no longer honest enough for the person you are becoming. And there may also be grief involved. Reinvention is not only about imagining a new future. It often requires grieving an old one. The career you thought would satisfy you, the marriage you thought would last, the version of yourself you thought you would become, the timeline you expected your life to follow. You may need to mourn some of those things before you can clearly see what still belongs to you. But there is another difficulty that keeps many people stuck even after they understand all of this. Because sometimes the biggest obstacle is not fear of the future. It is the way we keep trying to rebuild the future using an outdated definition of ourselves. One of the most subtle mistakes people make during reinvention is asking the wrong question. They ask, "How do I get my old self back?" It sounds reasonable. You remember a younger version of yourself who had more energy, more confidence, more curiosity, perhaps more hope. So you assume healing means returning to that person. But you cannot completely return to someone who had not yet lived through what you have lived through, and you may not actually want to. The person you were at 30 had certain strengths, but that person may also have tolerated things you no longer want to tolerate. They may have cared deeply about approval. They may have confused productivity with worth. They may have stayed silent to avoid conflict. They may have pursued goals because those goals looked respectable rather than because they felt meaningful. Reinvention becomes difficult when you keep measuring your future against a past version of yourself. You start saying things like, "I used to be more ambitious. I used to have more friends. I used to be more exciting. I used to know where I was going." And slowly, memory becomes a courtroom where the present version of you is constantly found inadequate. There is another trap as well: comparison. You open your phone and see someone your age changing careers, someone moving abroad, someone getting married again, someone launching a business, someone appearing healthier, happier, more successful, more adventurous. And suddenly your private uncertainty is being compared with someone else's visible milestone. You do not see their fear. their debt, their loneliness, their arguments, their second thoughts, you see the announcement, and you compare it with your confusion. That comparison can create shame, and shame often produces paralysis. Instead of asking, "What matters to me now?" you begin asking, "Why am I not where they are?" If you've been carrying that feeling quietly, share in the comments what part of starting over feels hardest for you right now. You do not need to explain your entire story. Even a few words may help another person recognize something they have been struggling to name. And if these conversations speak to where you are in life, consider subscribing to the channel. There is something else worth understanding here. Some of the habits keeping you stuck may once have protected you. Perhaps avoiding risk helped you create stability. Perhaps always taking care of others helped you maintain important relationships. Perhaps staying busy helped you survive seasons when slowing down would have forced you to feel emotions you were not ready to face. Those strategies may have served a purpose. Recognizing that does not mean you have to keep using them forever. You can appreciate what helped you survive an earlier chapter while admitting that it may not help you live the next one. And once you stop treating your past identity as something you must either preserve or destroy, a different possibility appears. You can begin building your next chapter without pretending the previous ones never happened. But how do you actually do that without blowing up your entire life? That is where reinvention becomes much more practical than most people imagine. When people hear the phrase, "reinvent yourself," they often imagine dramatic change. Quit the job, move across the country, end the relationship, sell everything, start a company, transform your appearance, become a completely different person. Sometimes major changes are appropriate, but dramatic action is not the definition of reinvention. Reinvention begins when the way you live becomes more aligned with what matters to you now. And that can start very quietly. One useful place to begin is by separating what is exhausted from what is actually wrong. If you hate everything on Friday night but feel slightly more hopeful after 2 days of rest, emotional exhaustion may be influencing the way you see your entire life. If the dissatisfaction remains even when you are rested, supported, and calm, it may be telling you something deeper. Instead of demanding an immediate answer, become curious. Ask yourself, what part of my life feels most unlike me right now? Not, what should I do with the rest of my life? That question is too large. Choose something smaller. Maybe you realize you miss creating things. Maybe you need friendships where you can speak honestly. Maybe your work no longer reflects your values. Maybe you have spent 10 years making decisions around other people's needs and no longer know your own preferences. Maybe you need more autonomy. Maybe you need more connection. Maybe you simply need something in your week that belongs to you. Once you identify that area, experiment before you overhaul. If you're wondering about a new career, you do not necessarily need to resign tomorrow. You might speak with someone already doing the work, take one class, volunteer, freelance, or spend several weekends learning more. If you feel socially disconnected, you do not need to suddenly become highly outgoing. You might message one person you trust and suggest meeting for coffee. If you miss creativity, do not demand that your creativity become profitable. Give it an hour on Saturday morning. If your identity has revolved around caring for others, practice making one small decision each week based on your own preference without immediately explaining or defending it. Small experiments give you information, and information reduces some of the fear created by imagination. You begin discovering what energizes you, what drains you, what still fits, and what only belonged to an earlier version of your life. Another useful practice is to notice the language you use about age. I am too old. It is too late. I missed my chance. Ask yourself whether those statements describe reality or disappointment. Some opportunities do change with age. Pretending otherwise would not be helpful. But some doors are different now is not the same as there are no doors left. A meaningful second half of life does not have to resemble the first half. In fact, trying to make it identical may be exactly what keeps you feeling lost. Because the real goal is not to create a younger life. It is to create a more honest one. And that brings us to perhaps the most important part of starting over, learning how to build an identity that can keep evolving instead of collapsing every time life changes. There is a difference between having an identity and being trapped inside one. A flexible identity says, "This is who I am right now, and I am still allowed to grow." A rigid identity says, "This is who I have always been, so this is who I must remain." Midlife often challenges the second version. Maybe you were always the reliable one. Can you still be reliable while admitting you need support? Maybe you were always career-focused. Can success mean something different now? Maybe you were always married. Can you still have a meaningful identity if that relationship ended? Maybe parenthood consumed much of your adult life. Can you love your children deeply while discovering a self that exists beyond raising them? Maybe you spent decades being responsible. Can responsibility now include responsibility for your own emotional life? These are not questions you answer once. You live your way into the answers. And sometimes rebuilding requires support. A trusted friend, a support group, a mentor, or a qualified mental health professional can provide perspective when your own thoughts have become circular. Seeking support does not mean you are incapable of figuring out your life. Sometimes another person simply helps you see choices that fear has made difficult to notice. You can also begin creating evidence of your new identity through small actions. If you want to become someone who values connection, make the call. If you want to become someone who protects their time, say no once where you would normally say yes automatically. If you want to become someone willing to learn, sign up for the beginner class even though you may feel awkward. If you want more adventure, do not wait for a life-changing trip. Visit one unfamiliar place in your own city. Identity often follows behavior. You do not have to feel completely confident before doing something new. Sometimes confidence arrives after you have shown yourself repeatedly that you can tolerate being uncertain and continue anyway. And notice the standard here. The goal is not to become fearless. It is not to wake up one morning with complete clarity. It is to become increasingly willing to participate in your own life again. Before we close, tell us one thing you would like to rediscover or rebuild in this next chapter of your life. It could be confidence, friendship, creativity, purpose, independence, peace, curiosity, or something entirely different. And if you know someone who is quietly wondering whether it is too late to begin again, consider sharing this video with them. Because you may eventually discover something surprising. Starting over after 40 is not always about starting from nothing. You are starting with experience, with lessons, with boundaries you did not have before, with a clearer understanding of what certain choices cost you, with losses that changed you, with strengths you may not even realize you developed. You are not returning to the beginning. You are beginning from where life has brought you. And those are two very different things. Feeling lost can make you believe that you need an entirely new identity before you can move forward. But perhaps you do not need to know exactly who you are becoming yet. Perhaps you only need enough honesty to recognize what no longer fits, enough curiosity to explore what still matters, and enough courage to take one small step without knowing where every step will lead. There may be parts of your old life worth keeping. There may be parts you need to grieve, and there may be parts of yourself that have been waiting years for enough space to finally emerge. You do not have to rebuild everything this month. You do not have to prove that your next chapter will be extraordinary. You simply have to begin participating in it. Maybe starting over after 40 is not the moment, when you finally invent a perfect new version of yourself. Maybe it is the moment when you stop forcing yourself to remain loyal to a version of your life that you have already outgrown. You are still allowed to change your mind. You are still allowed to become curious again. You are still allowed to build a future that looks different from the one you once imagined. And you do not need the entire map before taking the next honest step. Take care of yourself. And wherever you are in your rebuilding, Remember that you do not have to figure it all out alone.